Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to AlMaghrib's YouTube channel. Faith While Black is the series. Make sure that you turn on your notifications and subscribe so that you don't miss an episode.
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi sallim tasliman kathira. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu rasuluh. Welcome to another episode of Faith While Black. I am very happy to have a very special guest with us, and that is Tahanie Aboushi. Tahanie is a passionate civil rights attorney. I'm gonna read from her bio here, but for those of you who are in the New York area, you are very familiar with her and with her work. Raised in New York City, born and raised in New York City, spent the last decade fighting against racial and religious discrimination, the use of excessive force by law enforcement, and representing minors who are bullied, harassed, and sexually assaulted in schools. Through her impact litigation, Tahanie has changed policies within the FDNY and NYPD to protect New Yorkers. During Trump's Muslim ban, Tahanie had the legal team at JFK Airport. She led the legal team at JFK Airport, where she spent 4 straight days securing the release of persons detained by CPB. And she is a board member of the Manhattan Community Board 10 and serves on the St. John's University Legal Studies Advisory Board. And she previously served on the board of directors for the New York Civil Liberties Union, and is a graduate of both St. John's University and Syracuse School of Law. Tahanie, assalamu alaikum, welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ammar, how are you guys doing?
I'm very happy to have you. How are you?
Thank you for hosting this conversation. Great, alhamdulillah. Everything's been
very, very busy, running around from protest to protest. I see you on your Instagram. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you over there in the streets of New York.
I mean.
So we wanted to jump in to a number of things. Obviously, through your law work, you're very involved in really communal work, community work, as well as activism. And so I wanted to kind of just get an introduction to you, and for those of us who don't know you, what caused you to go into law, and particularly what caused you to go into the type of law that you practice.
So, alhamdulillah, you know, when I have a big family, I have 9 siblings. We were always very close. We are first generation American Palestinians here. My parents immigrated from Palestine back in, I would say, the 60s. And so we always—
That's early immigration, mashallah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. And, you know, we valued hard work, we valued education. My parents owned a small grocery store that was a staple in the neighborhood. And our neighborhood in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where we grew up, was a big mosh pit of immigrants and their first generation American kids. So everybody was experiencing that same dynamic. Unfortunately, when I was 14, my father was sentenced to 20 years in prison.
Allahu Akbar.
Yep, subhanAllah. And my youngest sibling was 6 at the time. And we were all at just different stages in our lives, but the whole process was so destabilizing and invasive. And once he was sentenced, it's like we didn't matter. Whatever happened to us, if we fell with the statistics of, you know, being in the gutter, it would be totally acceptable, because that is the part of the American story that's really what's typical and what's expected. But for me, there was a moment in the courtroom where the judge had interrupted himself, and he looks to the prosecutor and says, "What are you going to do with all these kids?" pointing to the 10 of us in the courtroom. The prosecutor said, "They're not my problem."
Wow.
For me, the system became my problem. And I was so offended, but also just, subhanAllah, I had this feeling that it was now my obligation to do something about it. Like Allah had showed me a clear injustice, and he said, "What are you going to do about it?" And, you know, my parents, we struggled a lot, but they always valued education and encouraged us to focus on our education. And so 3 of us became lawyers. I was the 3rd lawyer.
3 of the 10 became lawyers, mashallah.
Yep, 3/10 of us are attorneys. And for us—
all motivated by that moment, or similar, a similar trajectory because of that?
Yeah, I think so. I think for all of us, we realized that we were on our own. You know, we had no safety net. There was no plan B. But khalas, we were exposed to this very dark side of reality and life. And it's very hard. You know, some people can move past it and just do something else, but you're always affected by your experiences. For me, even when I first started practicing, these are things our community was suffering from, whether it's immigration or family law or criminal law or civil rights violations, whether you're Muslim or Arab or Desi or Black, everybody in our community was experiencing this. So for me, even if I wanted to do something different, I was always surrounded by it. And I never wanted to. I wanted to be that person when somebody said like, no, this big agency can abuse you, or this big agency can violate your rights, and they're just so big and there's nothing you can do about it. That was never an acceptable response for me. So that was my motivation to not only become an attorney, but to defend people who were like my family and my community, and then also take on big organizations that have really the authority to ruin lives with zero accountability.
Yeah. So this is the echo coming from, hold on. Do you hear an echo?
No.
No? Okay, good. So you grew up in Staten Island, and you grew up in Brooklyn. And at what point did you move to Staten Island, actually?
Right after my father's trial.
Okay.
We had to find a place that was more affordable. I thought we moved upstate for a second because I've just, no sidewalks, no, all trees. So we moved there to just an isolated place where we can just focus. We had to regroup. There's a lot of stigma that carries when you have somebody that, like my father, was going through a trial, a family that was going through the prosecution process, being sentenced. There's not many people that are willing to publicly stand with you or help.
That's something that unfortunately continues to get repeated again and again and again in all of these instances. And whether when you talk about stigma, whether it's even in the, I can't tell you how many times you hear about this one member of the family who traveled and went away for something, and in reality they were imprisoned. You find out later on that they were in jail, right? But in any case, so you moved to Staten Island, and from now you live in Harlem, correct?
Correct.
So Staten Island is very, very red. What was your experience growing up there, and moving to Harlem? How has the change been?
So living in Staten Island, for me, my mom always said it was like a hotel for me, because I was always out by like 6:30 in the morning, court, clients, work, and then getting back home very late, 10, 11 o'clock, because there's just an insane amount of work to do. And then the grueling commute. Staten Island is, it's beautiful to slow down and experience life kind of in a retire mode. But there's a reason why it looks like a Verizon map every election.
Yeah.
Very conservative, very traditional. Also an isolated borough. They usually call it, the forgotten borough. So it's like a whole other country. They've tried to annex themselves so many times from the city too as well.
Wow,
so,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, like Texas, it was like Staten Island should be their own state or their own whatever. Yeah. So, we didn't, growing up, I was in high school as well, in junior high school there was bullying. There was a lot of ignorance. I was a sophomore in high school when 9/11 happened. That was a whole field day. So there's a lot of that there. So, I mean, that's Staten Island. Once my father came back home for me, I felt like now I can just really jump into things. I was jumping into things before, but now I can, he's back home. Him and
How many years did he end up serving?
About 20.
Of the 20, he served 20? Okay.
Yeah, the last one was a halfway house in Brooklyn. And so he was still reporting. And so I wanted to get back to a neighborhood that felt like Sunset Park, where I grew up.
Yeah.
That was also where I mainly practiced, and that needed a heavy representation as well. And I found that home in Harlem.
Beautiful. So in the years that you've been serving, right, and you're running for district attorney of Manhattan right now. So this is You know, you're on the campaign trail. You're really busy, and I really appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to talk to us. One of the reasons this series is called Faith While Black, and you're Palestinian. There's a lot of similarities between Palestinian resistance and African American resistance here in the United States, and you're obviously very sensitive to a lot of issues, as well as being on the ground in New York right now. What have you seen in your practice as far as the different resources that communities have, the way policing is done? When even these conversations about defund the police and what have you, what have you seen as far as the variation in how communities look?
So the interesting part here is that when you talk about policing and you talk about violence and the way forward, what's often missing from the conversation is what are the communities that we're really trying to get out from under policing? Right? Like
yes, very important.
Everybody wants to do something new. Everybody wants to do something different. But when we talk about, let's say, defunding the police, right? People are like, oh my God, can you imagine not having police presence? And it's like, yeah, look at the suburbs.
Yeah.
Look at places where if you call the police, there has to have been something crazy going on, right? Not for walking your dog in the park or for having a barbecue or for wearing a hoodie. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So the victims of police violence have been people of color, and that still has not been acknowledged. Advocates have acknowledged it, the data confirms it, but you will not have law enforcement, very rarely would elected officials say, what we're trying to say is, how can we stop police violence against communities of color? Mm-hmm. So when you talk about where does defunding the police come from, it's get them out of our communities and off our back, and instead put the money in education, put the money in summer programs, economic opportunities, financial aid assistance, things of that sort, job opportunities. And that's really the conversations that's the part of the conversation that's kind of inferred, but it's not acknowledged much.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you're mentioning that, because I feel like it is important. Even that comparison, the suburbs, right, is very powerful, because you recognize that police exist. And let me tell you something, there is no place in the country that has a more overwhelming police presence than New York City. Yeah. I mean, it feels sometimes like you're under military occupation, or a police state. The amount of, you can't go a block without seeing cop cars. I guess we'll get to the NYPD in a little bit, but for now, you know, when we talk about even revamping the justice system, so defunding of the police is one thing, but just revamping the justice system in America, I'm sure there's lots of problems with it, but as a non-lawyer, I don't really understand what these challenges are. Can you break down exactly what's wrong with the criminal justice system, and why has there been so much resistance to these changes?
So the first part of the problem is the education. We've been made to believe that you can only have public safety if we're incarcerating people en masse. If we are criminalizing everyday normal life, and we are putting people in handcuffs and putting them in jail, and we otherize them and say, you're the bad person, so you deserve annihilation, and that's the only way that I can be safe, right? Yeah. And when you look at the data, the bread and butter of this system are really people suffering from social inequities like drug addiction, mental health, poverty, homelessness, domestic violence. And so what we're doing is saying, okay, let's take homelessness, for example. Person is homeless, they'll sleep wherever. Maybe they sleep on private property, and then they're arrested for trespass. They're processed through the system. They spend a couple of weeks in jail. Then they're released. And then where do they go? We've given them absolutely zero support to change their circumstances, but now they have a criminal record, which automatically makes things 100 times worse. It essentially allows for the legalized discrimination of people by cutting them out of financial assistance opportunities, housing opportunities. And so now you have this person that's already struggling. We've made it worse with the criminal record, and we've just sent them back out. So where do you think they're coming? They're going to come right back through our doors. And we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on these types of prosecution and incarceration because they're low-hanging fruit. And then you think about bigger players like the Weinsteins and Epsteins of our country, right? Wealthy, powerful men that have literally trafficked children through our borders.
Yeah.
Trafficked children through our cities. You know, rapists and sexual assaults and those kind of things. And we've looked the other way. The district attorney has looked the other way. And so when they talk about how are we going to be safe from who, right?
Yeah.
What are we doing? What does your safety look like? So for me, I've been working very hard to educate people. Like, for instance, one thing I go way back and I say, you know, I'm going to throw out 2 words and you tell me the race and gender that comes to mind. Don't think about it and don't be embarrassed by your impulse. But if I say the word criminal,
Black male.
okay, victim,
White female.
where does that come from?
Yeah.
And so when you talk about criminals running the street,
that was kind of scary just now, actually.
What do you, that's why when we talk about criminal justice reform and not being safe, who are we imagining? What is society really afraid of? Who are the bad and good guys here? And it comes back to these indoctrinations, whether it's from our schoolwork, books that we've read, TV shows, the glorifying of police violence with 150 different shows on TV and documentaries. So we have to take a step back and get out of that hype and acknowledge the racial disparities going on, the systemic racism of our system. And even go back, why were police departments created? They evolved today, but their origins are slave
to capture slaves.
So, you know, there was never a point in time where there was, okay, stop. This is why we were created, but this is no longer our job. Let's undo this indoctrination. Those moments never happened. And so these are just the aftermath of it. And that's really one of the root causes of why it's so hard to reconcile. So I'm not here to patch the system. It's working the way it's supposed to work. I'm here to essentially scrap it and really do.
But how do you scrap the system? Like, what conversations are you guys having within your legal world about scrapping the American justice system?
So I'll give you an example, and this is a little legalese, right? But, you know, when protests started happening and we saw law enforcement beating protesters left and right on the street. I mean, I was even part of it. I witnessed it myself. I was pushed and maced myself. And I've never seen such blind, deliberate anger and assault on protesters. And, you know, a lot of people were calling me, getting, you know, assessing their cases. Everybody had criminal summonses. And 90% of them were disorderly conduct, which is kind of like a catch-all, you didn't listen to me, but has implications. You're arrested and prosecuted for it. And so everybody's freaking out about it. And I started to call for prosecutors to decline to prosecute these cases. The officer may have arrested you for it, but me as the prosecutor, I decide who to charge and what to charge. I'm not going to honor that arrest. We're going to decline it. I'm dismissing your case before you even have one. And what that signals is, one, an independence from the NYPD, leadership by the DA, and it's not being, and it's reading the room. You take the circumstances, you understand what's going on, and then you lead in that respect. That's never been done before because most DAs are afraid to cross law enforcement. They're afraid to divorce from law enforcement because often the only source of evidence is law enforcement. And so just even starting that drive and divide starts to work on the foundation of how things are done in a DA's office. You're muted.
And aren't you worried about creating that divide then?
No, I've been doing this for a long time. I have no problem holding officers accountable. You know, if you were putting your kid in school and you found out that the teacher has a history of smacking kids around, wouldn't you want to know that? You know, you would be holding this teacher to a different standard than anyone else.
Absolutely.
If you found out the principal had engaged in unlawful conduct or sexual conduct, misconduct, wouldn't you think that's important for somebody in that position? If these people were not officers and they were civilians, that's a different conversation. But when you task yourself with the authority to interfere with our civil rights and the authority to really change the trajectory of someone's life through an arrest and prosecution, then the threshold for your behavior and the standard that we expect with which for you to deal with the public and uphold the truth is very high. And I'm not going to lower that bar.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect you and bless you.
Ameen.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope you're enjoying the Faith While Black Conversations. It's a series sponsored by Deeper Roots, the history of Islam in Americas, taught by Dr. Abdullah 𝐁𝐥𝐤. You can find out more about the course at www.almaghrib.online. Now back to the program.
So even with all of this conversation that's been happening, a lot of our Muslim immigrant community still hasn't caught up to the idea that there's still anything systemically wrong with the justice system. What have you seen specifically about the experience of Black people in the criminal justice system?
For people with, for Black people, I feel like it's expected. Every Black person has that conversation or that feeling, in my experience, that it's coming. There will be a day where you have some kind of interaction with police. Whereas other communities, it's still a foreign concept. And it's very sad to say, you know, that's why these videos are so traumatizing. And being on social media and seeing story after story is so traumatizing because it confirms this anxiety and the reality that, yes, you can be a Black man walking down the street. And you know, there have been NFL players that have been assaulted and accosted by police, teachers, professors, you name it. And then even within that example, it's okay, what if you weren't a teacher or a lawyer or an NFL player? You know, is that the exception to being harassed by the police?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the starkest difference that I see is that Black people prepare for that encounter early on and our communities react to it once it happens. And it's always a surprise when it does.
What about with regards to how they were treated by the criminal justice system?
Oh, I mean, that's a no-brainer. I think that the prosecution system, the machines of mass incarceration and mass criminalization are fed by Black and brown bodies, without a doubt. I mean, when the pandemic happened, our governor and mayor thought the brilliant idea was to have law enforcement enforce social distancing rules. And for me, I knew what that meant. That meant, here's an invitation to target Black and brown communities and low-income communities. Lo and behold.
When you say brown, just for clarity, do you mean Latino communities?
I mean Latino community, Hispanic communities, some Arab communities, Yemeni community, but it's mainly Hispanic. Okay. Hispanic or Latinx.
So Hispanic, do they receive a similar type of treatment in the criminal justice system to Black people, or?
I think Black people have it the worst.
Okay.
And I think runner-up are Hispanics.
Okay.
I even hate saying runner-up, but for instance, with the social distancing, of all the summonses issued, I think 95% were to people of color, with something around 40-something% to Black, and then low 30s to Hispanics.
Okay, and so, sorry to cut you off. You were saying that you understood immediately that this.
I knew what it was going to happen, and immediately we saw videos of Black and Hispanic people being dragged around the corner because they're not wearing a mask. And in Central Park, officers were saying, "Do you need water? Do you need a mask?"
Yeah, that was insane. Seeing those videos.
And then what's worse on top of that is when our elected officials see it and they see, guys, can we please all learn to wear masks? Take the pandemic serious.
Yeah.
And you look at it like, you know, and I think what's prompted all of this protesting and that frustration is that discrepancy, that disconnect, where us as community members, as people living through this experience, see one thing happening on the ground and our elected officials completely denying it.
Mm. And it's all happening real time, and the comparisons are there, and it's all being shown for everyone to see.
Yes.
And people aren't even trying to hide the treatment the preferential treatment that they're receiving from the police.
Right.
You're obviously very visibly Muslim. You're at the head of protests, and even beyond the activism, just being in the legal profession, being a lawyer and campaigning for district attorney. Do you feel that more Muslims should be concerned about the criminal justice system in America, be involved in the criminal justice system? To what extent? Why or why not? Have you learned anything where you said, you know what, I don't want Muslims to be involved. It's just a dirty game, for example. Like, what's your analysis?
I think Muslims have to absolutely be engaged. This is not a Black community only issue, a Latino community issue only. This is your civil rights. This is society being broken down. This is human beings being violated, controlled, and forced into the shadows of society. And it hurts all of us. I mean, I'm Arab, I'm Muslim myself, and I've been impacted by the system. And there's plenty of families like mine, but the problem with us is, like you said earlier, right? We hide things. We avoid it. We don't acknowledge it because it hasn't risen to the level where it's common enough that we want to talk about it. Even though we were railroaded after 9/11, we had to do special registration. Our men were incarcerated and snatched up without any notice to our families. All the rhetoric and stereotypes that came after it, and we still tried to say, okay, but we're not that.
Yeah.
And I think that otherization is our Achilles heel as marginalized communities. Is they tried to say, okay, Black community, at least you're not Arab, at least you're not Muslim. Okay, Muslim community, at least you're not the Black community. Okay, Black community, at least you're not the Mexican community or the Ecuadorian community. And so we each take our trauma and we're like, okay, my trauma is bad, but at least it's not like yours. When
that's
really,
an old game that they've been playing.
Divide and conquer. And the thing is, like, at the end of the day, all of us are getting violated. At the end of the day, none of us are safe from these violations, and we're all fair game. And so it absolutely is a Muslim issue. It's a Desi issue. It's an Arab issue. It's a Caucasian issue. This has to be, this is a really big deal. I mean, the impact that this one particular office has on your life, on society, and the trajectory of your family for generations to come cannot be understated.
Okay, I have a question for you though. I've learned leaving New York that other cities in the country are not like New York in the sense of just New York is just overwhelming. Maybe it's more similar to like a London, for example. Do you think that when we're talking about Muslim communities all over the country, can you speak on a national level that with the same confidence that we need to be involved, we need to be engaged?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, Islam advocates for justice, advocates against discrimination, advocates for equality and ensuring that your needs and your brother's needs are both met. Fairness. I mean, this is a foundation of Islam. So there is no, and Islam is a way of life. You don't pick and choose when to support equality and justice and when to look away, although we do that. So I do think globally we need to get involved. That includes acknowledging other countries that engage in the same behavior, governments that engage in the same behavior, and to be strong enough to criticize it and to speak out against it instead of normalizing it.
So speaking of globally, remind me of one global fraternity or one relationship that we've seen kind of established over the years is that between the Palestinian resistance and African-American resistance, or Palestinian activism and African-American activism. Famously during Ferguson, Palestinian activists were tweeting basically and informing the protesters in Ferguson, how they can, for example, wash the tear gas out of their faces.
Right.
What do you, as a Palestinian, what do you see to be similarities between Palestinian activism and Black activism?
Refusing to be erased, refusing to accept the status quo, refusing the response of just stop fighting, just stop resisting, right? And I think we have to fight for the value of our own life. And we always have people that are speaking on our behalf, that are saying what they think should happen, what they think we feel, what they think is best for us. And we're right here. We're completely excluded from the conversation. And so while they're deciding where we live and how we eat and how much money we make and where we go to school and where we live, we're sitting here, saying, no, we're going to decide now. And if that means we have to sacrifice more, then we sacrifice until we get it done. Because otherwise you're talking about another endless decade or more decades of just the same oppression. And we also have gone to the level of, what else is there left to lose?
Yeah.
How long are we going to remain quiet and not want to rock the boat or challenge the powers that be because we're afraid of backlash?
So that being said, you want to become you're running for district attorney of Manhattan. What is a district attorney? It's the chief prosecutor, right?
It's the chief enforcement officer of the borough.
So what does that mean for a regular
the county
person?
So the DA decides who to charge and what to charge, decides what evidence is gathered, investigated, presented to a jury, decides how cases are resolved, plea deals, community service, different programs, decline to prosecute, or full-on prosecution and demanding jail time.
Excellent. So being that we're coming from those communities that you described, normally we do not think of the prosecutor in a great light. In fact, if you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a defense attorney so that you could, save people and defend people. And so when you turn around and you say, hey, I want to be the prosecutor, you're switching sides on us. Like, why would you want to be a prosecutor?
Because it's not switching sides, is that I'm done with damage control.
Okay.
I'm not going to wait until rights are violated and then come back and try to undo it and try to make a person whole, because the humiliation remains, the record remains, the experience remains. Here in New York City, over 90% of our cases end in a plea deal. People don't serve much jail time. I would say between 4 and 7% actually serve jail, prison, or probation time, or some combination of either jail and probation, or prison and probation. And the reason for that is because people don't have the time and money to linger in the system. And so even though you may be innocent, there may not be evidence. A case may take too long and witnesses disappear, or in domestic violence, partners don't want their other partners prosecuted, right? And so they wear people out until they take whatever's on the table so they can get back to their lives.
Yeah.
And so why, right? You think about that. If we guide things with truth and justice, why spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and load up these ADAs with all these cases, knowing we're going to dismiss them? So there's a lot of things that the reason why prosecutors have a bad reputation is because they have been proceeding in that way, where it's convict at all costs, hide evidence, wear them out, everything else. But do we have enough evidence to establish these charges? Do we have a person that's guilty in front of us? Do we have somebody that needs resources and help instead of being put in a jail cell with taxpayer money for a couple of days at a time? And I think that bare minimum has really not been done by prosecutors, even though they're obligated to it, right? Yeah. As prosecutors, they're obligated to protect not only victims, but the accused in their path in pursuit of justice.
So the prosecutor is the one who can decide whether to go forward with a case or to press charges or not.
Right.
I mean, that's very, very powerful. And they can basically decide. So for example, they have a troubled young person in front of them, they can decide whether, you know what, give that person community service, they've learned their lesson, versus, for example, throw them in jail and ruin their life.
Right.
I mean, that's incredibly powerful. And if that's the case, then you would think you would want more people who look like us as prosecutors, who come from our communities.
That, and people whose views of justice is not to convict at all costs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so you are, we've talked about reimagining the police. We've talked about defunding. What do you think realistically right now? Keyword realistically. What should we be working towards with regards to this moment and this movement that's happening right now? Already kind of, you feel like people have stopped talking about it on social media. What should we be pushing forward to as far as a conclusion to the protests that were sparked, or the rebellion, whatever term you want to call it, with the murder of George Floyd?
We need to invest in our communities. We need to stop asking communities that we've taken so much from to now give more. And the reason why people are calling for defunding the police here in New York, they have almost a $6 billion budget. And that's not even the entire budget. But so far, with the city redoing their budget, they've slashed Department of Education, they've slashed summer youth programs, just so many opportunities. I mean, they gave people, the federal government gave people $1,200 to live off of 4 months.
Yeah.
And so there's been basically no support for everybody who's been struggling, going on 5 months without jobs, right? But here you have another 500 NYPD officers in the subways, right?
Yeah.
To watch people who are gonna fare evade. People don't have money, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about kids being on the street because you canceled so many youth programs that employ them in the summer, right? But we have enough cops running the streets. And so the likelihood of interactions between civilians and officers are so much more higher now, because people have literally nothing else available to them to make their way and refigure things out.
Mm-hmm.
So investing in the community structure, putting money towards after-school programs, economic opportunities, job-ready programs, school-ready programs, daycare and after-school for childcare, that's a big problem, because everybody knows how expensive the city is, but there's no help. The wages have been stagnant. Childcare is almost as expensive as school tuition. I mean, right now, if you try to put your kid in a daycare, that's a couple of $1,000s a year.
Yeah.
For babysitting. And so everybody's under a lot of economic stress, a lot of social stress here, and it's time that we invest more money in getting people on a path not only to be successful, but stable and independent, so that they can also contribute back to society.
I wonder if there are any successful models in the US about a police force that was defunded or reimagined or what have you, and they invested in the community, and whether that affected the crime rate or not. To some extent, there's a prison industrial complex. There are people who make money off of crime. And so you coming in, campaigning as a DA, this is a question that I asked you, and you're very vocal against the NYPD on, I'll let you phrase, but it just seems very, very brazen. And I wonder how realistic it is for you to win a campaign challenging, for example, the NYPD, which is just this, as you mentioned, $6 billion force in the city. Obviously, this is deliberate by you. Obviously, this is calculated. What are your thoughts on that?
So what we're talking about here is not against the NYPD. It's against criminal misconduct by officials, people who are tasked with not only our safekeeping, but have the authority to impact our lives in the ways I explained earlier. And so we have to hold them to a high standard. When people criticize the police, you're talking about police violence, right? If we see an officer walking down the street, nobody's going to say, you're a bad person only because you're a police officer. No, but when law enforcement across this country can brazenly kill people on video, whether it's for 9 minutes as they strangle life out of them, or an intoxicated man sleeping in his car, or a woman in her home, or any other examples that we've had to deal with, right? We call that out. And then that's when the pushback happens. Oh, you don't like law enforcement. No, we just don't like when you do it this way.
Yeah.
And so, and the fact that there is this, let us do it the way we want to, or don't bother us, or we're not going to work for the city, that's a big problem. And that's what I'm trying to combat here, is that no one is above the law. Badge or not, privilege or not, right? You commit wrongdoing, you're under the same system. And then I always also say is, what are you so afraid about with the system? Why is an officer or an elected official, what are you so afraid about if you're processed through this system?
Yeah.
Why is it okay for the rest of us to go through this, right?
And to be told if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to be worried about, right?
Got nothing to hide. How bad is the system that you don't trust your fate in the hands of prosecutors?
That's a powerful point, yeah.
You know, and I think that that's also something that they're not called to respond to, because they know very well how the system is built. How you are guilty before proven innocent, and then you end up trying to prove your innocence as opposed to starting from that point. So there's that part. And I also say, you know, in Texas, they created this unit of response for people in mental health crisis. So here in New York City, we make the NYPD respond for every agency. Mental health crisis, homelessness, domestic violence, even violent crimes. The NYPD does it all, and they shouldn't. And the NYPD agrees with this, right? Every time an agency fails, we say, hey, NYPD, go save us.
Yeah.
And then when the NYPD messes up, we're like, you didn't do your job the right way. When meanwhile, you have people pursuing graduate degrees, PhDs in this stuff, but we're sending in people who have 6 to 8 months of academy training to go deal with mental health crisis.
Yeah.
So you guys have a unit where if someone is having a mental health crisis, they send these guys in to talk a person out, to de-escalate a situation, and they understand the illnesses that they're dealing with. These people aren't violent, right? This is the nature of their illness. And I think that one alleviates the burden on the NYPD, right? And also gives us a chance to really respond to what's happening here. Someone having a mental health crisis is not a criminal.
Yeah.
Someone that's having a mental health crisis is not operating with all of the faculties that they would have without that mental illness. So to have somebody responding that can understand it, that can identify these symptoms and say, no, I recognize what's happening here. This is not a violent person trying to hurt people. This is someone in a crisis. So if we take all these tasks of the NYPD and break them down into those types of departments, I think things would be way better.
Do you feel though that there are people who haven't invested, like that would be the challenge, that you have obviously a lot of money flowing in, you've got budgets, you've got...
Absolutely. I think there'll always be people that say, no, people need to be arrested and we need to be prosecuted and the police have to be a military and we need prisons. And that's fine. That's the argument and the way that's won for life. That's always been the prevailing argument, and times are changing. And so it's a matter of taking that power out of those hands slowly but surely and moving us away from that prison industrial complex.
Excellent. Jazakallah khair. So where can people find out more about you and your campaign and the work that you're doing?
So they can go to tahanie4da.com. You can Google me, all that other good stuff comes up. You know, I would love to have them pitch into the campaign. We're working on really awesome policies that we'll be rolling out soon. We have really a great amount of momentum and support on the campaign. So jump in with whatever skills that you have. Also feel free to donate. That's going to be a huge part of the success of this campaign. And now's the time. I really want people to understand that we are in a historic moment in time. When you go back to your history books and you think about things like a civil rights movement, and just so many amazing things that have happened when the American with Disabilities Act was passed, when women were given the right to vote, immigration laws that were passed, and you think about, you know, what was going on at the time to propel this kind of change. You are in it right now. We are in it, where elected officials are listening to the power of the people, and the people are demanding things, and it's getting done. I mean, here in New York, we've had legislation sitting around for over 5 years. They couldn't get it passed. These marches happened, and in a matter of 10 days, majority of these laws went into effect. Our governor sat down and signed it. So why, right? They existed, but our elected officials were in this bubble complaining and fighting, but then the people said enough is enough.
Yeah.
And so I want everybody to know how important they are and the impact that they have on society and the impact they have on changing things. Like, it literally is up to you. And what happens from here moving on is going to depend on how serious we take this and how much effort we put into flipping the system.
Jazakallah khair. I love that. Flipping the system. MashaAllah. Okay, Tahanie, Jazakallah khair. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for, you hyped me up, man. You hyped me up.
This is what it's about. I mean, you know, alhamdulillah, we have, you know, it might not be.
I feel like flipping this table I got going on right now.
You know, alhamdulillah, like Tupac says, you know, although we had it rough, we always had enough.
Aywa.
That's what I always think about. And so what are we doing with what we have? And are we using it to advance?
Well, I don't know how I feel about you being from Brooklyn and quoting Tupac. I mean, but it's okay. We'll accept it.
You know, Biggie has a lot of.
He also says they got money for war but can't feed the poor.
That's right.
Yeah.
A lot of truth in his songs, you know, and I just think, you know, this is a rare opportunity, and I really want us to have that fire in our chest to make something happen.
Okay. Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair, Tahanie. We're going to put up your socials on the description and all that. People will be able to find you. Really appreciate your time.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much.
Very welcome. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.